We are back on your evening roundup show on Connect FM 91.5 with me, Yasmin Gandham. On the phone with me right now is Loveleen Kaur. She's a community organizer and a digital storyteller based in Toronto, and she's going to be speaking to us about anti-Blackness within the Indo-Canadian community. Good evening, Loveleen. How are you?
Hi, everyone. I'm tired, but good.
I'm sorry. I know there is a time difference, so I know it's a little bit late for you over there in Toronto, but thank you so much for joining us.
That's okay. It's not even about that. It's just about the fact that, it takes a lot of work to address anti-Black racism in our community and in our organizations and where we work, and it's the time for not even allies, I wouldn't say. That's like the incorrect word. It's for all of us, our responsibility to show up, and I hope we all feel exhausted, not by the media, but by the level of work that we're doing to address problematic beliefs in our communities, because it actually, our beliefs are actually actively contributing to the deaths of Black folks in our communities, and Black community members are calling on us. I know you just asked me, how are you? But they're calling on us to show up. And
right.
So I'm tired because the Brown community is unwilling to look in the mirror and reflect on how we are responsible and complicit and what we can do to change it. And it's really sad and frustrating how much work it's taking to get people to even see the basic humanity behind and for Black communities that are fighting right now.
And you mentioned the anti-Blackness narrative within our community, the Indian community, and of course that is very prevalent, but where do you think that comes from? Where does it stem from?
I mean, it definitely stems from British colonization, right? And I think that this is why it's really important to challenge it together. The racial hierarchies that have been created in our societies have ultimately been created because of colonization. It served, we were colonized by the British, but have we really decolonized the values that they left behind in us? And we haven't, right? Even shadeism, colorism, judging people, their beauty based on their skin color, that's disgusting.
Right.
And casteism. The perpetuation of all of that is deeply integrated into colonization. And colonization taught us, and British especially, even in and the thing is, North America and India, we were ruled by the same rulers. People forget that up until very recently in Canadian history and Indian history, we had the same queen. So the same values were being perpetuated, which meant that, Black folks were slaves, brown folks were indentured laborers, or and the way that colonization worked for Black and Indigenous people is that they ransacked the lands, and the people were meant as resources and seen as not as humans, but as tools. And where brown people were seen as the administrative, we were just they took our land's resources, but they let our Raja and Rania, let our kings and queens continue to rule over us because our kings and queens sold us out.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've kind of perpetuated a very similar system in Canada. We came here, we never stood beside our Black and Indigenous communities, and then we also recreated the same sort of colonial systems where we create gurdwaras, politicians, organizations that only fight and care for Sikh or South Asian issues. And what they don't realize is that police brutality is a South Asian issue. The number of times, Sikh community has experienced police brutality in India. The fact that, we actually have, Black folks within our religious communities that don't feel safe.
Right.
Our neighbors, our friends in our schools, they're our neighbors. And we refuse to look at them with the same dignity that we wish would be afforded to us. And what we refuse to recognize is that there is a parallel world that is happening. There is a world where certain bodies are heavily policed. There is a world where certain bodies are afraid of leaving their house because of how they'll be treated, or going to work because of what somebody will say about them, talking to their children about what to do when the police talk to them.
Yeah.
And it's just really unfortunate that instead of, and a whole community that is stigmatized, a whole community that experiences, Black and Indigenous people experience poverty at unprecedented levels, and they are also in prisons at unprecedented levels. And that's not because they're inherently bad. It's because the systems have created these processes, and it's our responsibility to say, hey, if we live here, is this we're not immigrants. We live here. We need to take responsibility for the systems that are getting created. And we need to say that as our job as people that live on this land is to make sure that everybody gets to live a dignified life where they are respected. And it's shocking to me that even though in our communities, people in Punjabi will, when they see a police officer, they'll say, Mama, yeah. Like, we know that, like, we have a mistrust of police within our communities as well. But how come when it translates to another community's mistrust being on the streets, then we doubt them and we try to protect the perpetrators of that violence? And even, like, I don't understand, like, anyway, sorry. That was the question.
No, absolutely. And you're right. There is this double standard, I guess you can say, that what we experience is legitimate, but what the Black community experiences isn't. And I also want to ask you about the fact that we in the Punjabi community have benefited from being able to embody parts of Black culture, whether that's their music or their language or their fashion, without suffering the same consequences or experiencing the same inequalities.
100%.
So,
100%.
So how can we do better? How can we stand in solidarity?
I mean, I think, like, number one, I always have to say this, like, I am just one person. It's wild. I have been talking about these issues within our community for the last 10 years. And I actually find it kind of sad that only now people are, I also want to say I'm not the authority on this. The best thing we can do to be in solidarity is to listen and be willing to learn and accept and really accept that in our systems, like, anti-Black racism sentiment is embedded into our system. It's embedded into our education, not just in Canada, but in our community, in our society. So when a Black person comes to you and says, what you did was problematic, we can't question it. We just have to say, okay, how do I do better? You know? And, like, we need to be committed. We can't have pride. And, like, I run a weekly program called Bronte in Politics that we started because of the pandemic, but it's kind of turned into a space for like-minded Sikhs, particularly, and other folks to talk about important issues that are facing us. And we talked about it, that there is a sense of, like, they say white fragility when, those videos of the Karens and the Beckys taking videos of Black folks living their lives.
Right.
Saying, what are you doing here? Oh, my God. We do the same thing. Like, we have brown fragility. Like, anytime a brown man gets called on using the N-word, oh my God, like, holy. But the problem is that it's too late. Like, we can't just talk about the N-word anymore because you're right. I mean, have you seen how our Bhangra music, Black people in their videos and, like, random rappers and artists, even Bollywood music, and the very fact that we have Punjabi rap, which is, like, obviously beautiful, like, Black folks aren't trying to claim that, but the thing is that if you come out in one way and you dress quote unquote Black, and then that's not actually who you are, how you were raised, and then when you get more wealthy, like Lily Singh, like Superwoman, then you can drop that, then you treat it like a costume. And it's not a costume. It's not just, like, something that's stylish and fun. Black people's lives are not, like, they're not a fad, And just like you said about music, like, I grew up listening to hip hop, and I know, like, and I know so many brown people love hip hop.
Yeah.
And so to me, which is beautiful. And I always used to think that it was because we related somewhat to the experiences of like struggle and oppression and felt valued and validated that there was something else in English other than like to listen to other than like, I don't know, Miley Cyrus or like Celine Dion. Right. And so to me, I'm just like, you want to know what's going on? Like, why don't you actually like listen to the hip hop lyrics that say, fuck, F the police, or like, buy my way out of jail, but you can't buy freedom. Like, if we're listening to Tupac, Kanye, J. Cole, like NWA, the birth of hip hop is through social justice, was about police brutality. If you watch shows about like movies like Straight Outta Compton, like, yeah, it's a movie about a hip hop group, NWA. Or if you watch the movie about Biggie or Tupac, they're still talking about systemic issues that they experience as a Black community. And like, how can we play that music, rap along to that music, go to those concerts, and then just like pretend that we didn't hear what they were talking about? Like, that is idiotic to me. And I've heard a lot of Black friends say that they are noticing the silence on their feeds and in their like messages of all their non-Black friends. And right now, I think we need to ask ourselves, it is no longer, people of color. It is very clear that Black and Indigenous people sit on one side, and people of color are choosing very selectively who they want to support. And for me right now, the issue is that we are having a global movement. And just like when we study about, British colonization or Punjab and police violence, or 1960s civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, that's the moment that we're in right now. And it's like, been in the making for a very long time. So this is not really the time to question what's happening. There is an all-out civil war happening in the United States. And like, the rage is completely understandable. The systems have been committing violence on these folks. And it is not our time to debate whether or not what they do or don't do is right, or whether or not we agree or do not agree. Like, this is the legacy of 500 years of violence. Yeah. And we are now also a part of that violence. Even though the British taught us these values, we can be the ones to undo these values, question them in our homes, question them in our workplaces, look amongst our friends. Like, there's so many ways that it shows up. Like, I've seen so many friends who date interracially, but like won't marry them, or introduce them for fear of like being called out. Right. Or people who do have interracial relationships, their friends don't even support them. If you work in an organization and like, the other thing is that the South Asian community, unlike other communities, like next to white folks in this country, there are like the next language after English spoken in the House of Commons is Punjabi. So if people tell me, like, it is actually embarrassing right now to have people in very, very South Asian people in very high points of leadership all across the country. So Black community members, I know from my conversations, look at us and are sad and are frustrated to be like, you folks usurped all the political power in this country and economic power. And instead of doing something meaningful with it, did nothing but defend our own interests.
And I want to ask you too about the protests. I saw something really interesting on Instagram with this whole Blackout Tuesday that's happening, and the fact that until we address this ongoing systemic racism that you've spoke about and the embedded practices, the entrenched practices of how we view Blacks specifically, the consequences will not change. The fact that racism is learned and this is what we need to work towards. What would you say on this? Do you think protesting is sufficient enough to shift those entrenched ideologies.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. Like, I agree that the protest is not the only thing, because, right, like I was saying earlier, it's just the fact that we are in a very important global moment in history. The pandemic highlighted the segregation in our countries. The pandemic highlighted the lack of, appropriate responses to working class, people of color all across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And and then police brutality happens, and these aren't new issues. It just continues to flame onto the anger, how kicked to the side these issues are. So yes, the protests are just a movement. But what needs to happen is, after these protests dies down, is when we really need to kick into gear to start doing our part for system change. If you are a manager, if you are a coordinator, if you have any sort of hiring power, are you hiring Black people? Are you hiring Indigenous people? Are you hiring people of color?
Mm-hmm.
And if you are like in your families and somebody says something problematic, do you actually address it? Do you face it head on? To address anti-Black racism or any type of discrimination that we internalize, we need to actually be willing to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to lose friends and followers. We have to be willing to be on the right side of justice,
mm-hmm.
even if it means to be on the wrong side of normal society.
What's acceptable. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what I'll say, too, is that because we're on an important moment in our history, and because we don't have time to convince anybody, when we look back on this moment 40 years from now, they won't say, what did the white people do? Because that's what we say when we look at the civil rights movement and the Ku Klux Klan. They will look at the South Asians and they will say, what did one of the wealthiest communities in this country with the most amount of political power, what did they do? And I will say that we were silent. All of our politicians across the country, MPPs, MPs, MLAs, city councilors, have been gravely silent because they are more concerned with impressing the status quo uncle politics
mm-hmm.
and maintain their votes instead of actually saying something of any substance. So that's what I have to say is, people who want to say solidarity, this is no longer about solidarity. It's too late for solidarity. It is now for responsibility, and every person has to take on some responsibility for what they got to do.
Yeah.
And donating is only one part of it. We actually have the opportunity to hold our politicians accountable. That's our job.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We elect them. They should be responsible to us. But the very fact that we don't hold them responsible to police brutality just because it doesn't impact us the exact same way, even though I know in Vancouver, Surrey, Abbotsford, same with Brampton and Mississauga, the police are incredibly racist towards Desis, and the way they crack down on our quote-unquote gang violence and the way they treat us is so stigmatizing.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of talking, we do need more mental health programs in our communities too. We do need more art programs. We need more options for brown men to succeed and thrive. And so Black liberation, what they're asking for is inherently tied with our liberation.
Right, right.
What are we going to lose? We are actually going to gain, just like the 1960s in Canada and the U.S., civil rights movements got us the right to vote too.
Absolutely.
They fought for our right to vote. They fought for us to be more diverse in workplaces. They created the human rights codes around racism.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to interrupt you. I love everything you're saying, but we're running out of time. Thank you so much, though, Loveleen. I really, really appreciate it, and I think it's so important for the Indian community to hear everything you're saying. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Of course. Thank you for the opportunity, and not to do a shameless plug, but more just to continue these conversations. People can message me on Loveleen at loveleen.kay on Instagram. I've been having a lot of conversations with folks about this in their communities and how to address it. So if anyone wants to continue the conversation, please send me a message there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.